All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here with us this morning. My name is Jason Bordoff, professor at the School of International Public Affairs and direct the Center on Global Energy Policy. This is a really important conversation. I think we see that reflected in the people who've joined us as panelists and also the number of people who are here in the room this morning. I'll introduce our panelists in just a minute. We're going to make this pretty informal and conversational. I'm going to pose some questions from here to our panelists. The topic is important because I think anyone who works in this space knows that we need to be moving much more quickly than we are to reduce emissions around the world if we take goals like 1.5 or 2 degrees warming or anything even close to that seriously. And the last year's IPCC report highlighted that this could include, in a very cost-effective way, the protection and restoration of natural ecosystems such as forest and grasslands and wetlands. These nature-based solutions are intended to protect, transform, restore the land, allowing nature to both reduce emissions and also to absorb more CO2 from the atmosphere. So we're going to talk about the role of nature in tackling climate change this morning. I'll introduce our panelists in just a moment, but let me first say that this event is being webcast live. The full video will be available on the Center on Global Energy Policy's website in the coming days. For those who are watching online, you can participate as well as people here in the audience, asking questions of the panelists. We're going to have a conversation for a bit, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. If you want to submit your question virtually, you can do that on Twitter at the hashtag CGEP events, at our Twitter handle, Columbia U Energy. So this really is a fantastic group of people to discuss this important topic. Their bios, we could spend the whole hour and a half reading their bios, so I'll just very briefly introduce them in the order of, we'll go start with Michelle, I think. So Michelle Mannion is the lead economist at the World Resources Institute, brings over 20 years of experience conducting economic policy and policy analysis on issues of climate change and energy and air quality and water quality and natural resource management, and has worked with quantitative economic, energy, and health modeling tools, cost-benefit analysis, economic impact analysis, program evaluation, and lots of work communicating with policymakers. If you haven't seen the work WRI has done on this topic, it's really exceptional. Dirk Forrester, many of you know, the CEO and president of the International Emissions Trading Association, previously served as managing director at NatSource, the manager of one of the world's largest carbon funds, and served as chairman of the White House Climate Change Task Force in the Clinton administration, served as an assistant secretary at U.S. Department of Energy earlier in his career. My colleague, Ruth DeFries, university professor at Columbia. For those, I'm new to academia, I still feel like new, so if you're not, when you join academia, you learn that's a big deal, being a university professor. She's a really big deal. She's the Denning Family Professor of Sustainable Development in the Department of Ecology, Evolution, and Environmental Biology at Columbia, and her research looks at how land use affects climate change, biodiversity, other ecosystem services, as well as human development. And pick your honor in the academic community, the National Academy of Sciences, the MacArthur Genius Award, the list goes on and on. Ruth has earned them. And also, consistent with what we do at the Center on Global Energy Policy every day, has spent a lot of her time not only doing academic research, but communicating that to audiences outside of academia, more popular audiences, including through her book, The Big Ratchet: How Humanity Thrives in the Face of Natural Crisis. Martin Wetzler is Director of Integrated Gas and New Energies at Royal Dutch Shell, member of the executive committee there, oversees 38 countries for Shell, a company he joined about a quarter century ago, and has held a variety of financial, commercial, general management roles in Shell's upstream, downstream trading businesses. Spent a lot of time with him. He's one of the most thoughtful leaders that I know in the energy sector. And if we're going to talk about natural climate solutions today, if you want to hear him talk about that and much more, you can check out the podcast we did together not long ago, which I think was the most popular one in our podcast series of the year last year. So you know he's going to be entertaining today. And then finally, Todd Stevens is Executive Director, Conservation Science and Solutions at the Wildlife Conservation Society. Before coming to the Wildlife Conservation Society, he was a project leader at the Boston Consulting Group, and before that worked in investment banking and in private equity. So really a interesting and diverse set of perspectives from the NGO world, from the industry, from academia. So I'm going to let everyone just put a few ideas on the table with a few opening comments, and really what I think would be most helpful to frame the conversation is, first, let's just help make sure everyone understands what we're talking about. When we talk about natural climate solutions, that covers a lot of different things, and it would be helpful if you could talk a little bit about what you think we're talking about and what we should be talking about. So there's maybe a lot of things under that umbrella. Some might be able to make a much bigger dent in the emissions challenge than others. Which ones do you think are most important, should have the greatest focus when we think about their cost effectiveness, when we think about the dent they can make in emissions? And then I want to come back to sort of the administrability. How do we actually pick up some of these opportunities from a policy or economic standpoint? So that's sort of a broad framing question. Just tell us what we're talking about and why we're talking about it. And Michelle, let me start with you, and then we'll just kind of go down the row.
Certainly. Am I on here? How's that? Can everyone hear me? Great. Thank you so much, Jason, and for the Center for this invite. It's an incredibly important topic. WRI has been working at the kind of intersection of the climate system, the energy system, the forests and land and energy and water for decades. And this is really, the discussion about natural solutions is really focusing kind of across our institute and across all of our international offices into sort of, what is the scale of the problem and what is the opportunity and how do we seize that opportunity? So I'll sort of frame this with a couple of kind of high-level just statistics. And I think the discussion questions are a really great prompt, and I'll get into a little bit on a couple of these questions because they're pretty seminal. I mean, I've been working on this issue for almost 20 years now. My first kind of foray into the question about forest offsets and carbon sequestration as a climate mitigation strategy dates back to the early discussions around setting up the regional greenhouse gas cap and trade initiative here in the Northeast, and California's program also for reducing emissions from the fossil fuel sector, but looking at land-based solutions as a potential way of augmenting the overall mitigation curve. So these questions have been around for a long time, but they've taken on a much greater urgency given where we're at with respect to the overall kind of climate math, if you will. And that math says that, the land sector is about 20 to 25% of current net global emissions. But on the opportunity side, if we can actually figure out how to take advantage of these opportunities, we can probably get a third of the way to the overall mitigation goal we need by 2050 if we can restore both the carbon that's been lost thus far, but also reduce additional losses and augment lands that previously supported forests and carbon, particularly in coastal areas too. So that's both the problem and the opportunity. I think there's a lot of questions about how do we do this the right way, but not letting the perfect be enemy of the good. And I mean, I think the question about whether we can substitute reductions from fossil fuel use with improving forests, I think that discussion is sort of over. We need both and. It can't be either or. There's simply no way to reach these 1.5 and under 2 pathways without both of these sectors making enormous contributions by 2050. So I think right now we're in a place where we're talking about sort of how do we arrange this temporally? Like we need to get the investments going in natural solutions immediately. And we know that we've got some sectors where we don't have the great technical solutions right now, at least not commercially viable and affordable in shipping and aviation and so forth. So how do we sort of think about the overall optimal curve, if you will, to get to where we need to be by 2030 and by 2050? And so certainly we need to keep that in mind, that we've got to have these solutions and opportunities sort of augment and be part of absolute reductions from the fossil fuel sector as well. We need to do it in a way that creates no additional harm. So we need to sort of move away from the idea of these giant sort of industrial carbon farms, if you will, and think about the other sustainable development and social goals that we've got for these communities, particularly bringing in folks from the local community to benefit from these in a way that is has not been the case to date. And certainly we need to bring them to scale. Right now, the discussion about jurisdictional level versus doing individual projects, our institutional viewpoint is the time for projects is long past. They were incredibly useful in their day. They taught us a lot about measurement and verification. They taught us a lot about what kind of carbon accumulation do you get from different reforestation activities in different places. So they certainly had their place, the projects, but we're now at a place where we've got to move to jurisdictional scale, and that also coincides with how we actually set up our climate reductions. That's at the national scale, and certainly land governance and policy generally happens at the national scale, sometimes devolves down below to the subnational level. So we're very much of the mind that we've got to tackle this at the jurisdictional scale, acknowledging that not all countries are there yet as far as capacity. So there's part of the tree standard that's saying you can start with a subnational approach as long as you got about 30% of forest cover included in that jurisdictional subnational approach, and then sort of move up to national level by 2025. So that seems like a reasonable approach. There's a really important question here, and even the wording of this question I thought was interesting. What are the trade-offs between natural solutions and other societal demands like food production? There can't be any, right? We cannot trade off feeding people for restoring the climate. We need both. We can restore the climate, but if people are hungry, and we already have 800 million people that are undernourished or malnourished. So we basically are looking at a situation where feeding the additional population we'll have by 2050 will require a 50% increase in food production. We covered a lot of this in the World Resources Report last year. You can look online for a lot of detail here. But essentially what that means is probably bringing another 600 million hectares into production at our current levels of agricultural productivity. 600 million hectares. We can't do that. So how do we address the food needs? And part of it is improving agricultural productivity on existing lands, which are about 37% of total land cover, excluding Antarctica. So we've got to increase productivity. We've got to reduce food loss and waste, and distribution needs to be vastly improved. There's a lot of talk about shifting diets to plant-based solutions. So all of those things need to happen. And then we've got to then sort of reforest and restore those 600 million hectares that we can hopefully free up from production if we can achieve those gains on the agricultural side. So that linkage between the food system and what we're talking about here for natural-based solutions and the societal implications of that, I can't really say too much about that. It's incredibly important. So I think I'll end there. I'll put in one plug for something we're working on at WRI that will hopefully be part of kind of the supporting infrastructure. We've done a lot of work on greenhouse gas reporting and over the years. So we're working on a land-specific protocol for companies and other institutions to report out their activities on the land side and have that be consistent with overall greenhouse gas reporting. So we should have a draft of that next year, and we're going to be pilot testing that for another year after that. So we look forward to folks that are interested in engaging on that. And I'll leave it at that.
Just a quick 20-second follow-up. We've got a lot to cover, but as an economist, the cost effectiveness of these options, just say a quick word about that, because I think they tend to look pretty good.
Yeah, and there are a lot of estimates out there. There's sort of a real sweet spot, sort of in the $35 to $50 per ton. You bring in a lot of additional supply, theoretically, based on a lot of the modeling. And that does account for things like the need for measurement and verification and a lot of the accounting and administration. But the preponderance of the cost is really the opportunity cost, sort of what would happen to that land otherwise. And we know, just reading about the fires in Brazil this morning about, these ranchers that are burning additional lands to bring in more ag into production. So, there's also an enforcement issue here. A lot of the highest value forests, both for biodiversity and for carbon, are really dense tropical rainforests, and so there is an opportunity there up to $50, and then beyond up to $100. Possibly up to 200 to 300 gigatons of carbon, but we haven't really gotten to that scale, so it's very attractive, but I just want to caution that sort of getting there and getting past some of the institutional and governance issues is going to be challenging and may add to that cost a little bit.
So
But-
Dirk, can you talk to this and bring that perspective of someone who has spent a lot of time thinking about how to create the incentive systems to send a carbon price signal that would allow us to pursue some of these opportunities?
Sure. Thanks, Jason. And yeah, I think I can follow Michelle nicely. So I lead the International Emissions Trading Association. We're a global business group that works on carbon pricing issues around the world. Been around for about 20 years. And I think in our community, there's been a real sea change in the way people think about this set of issues. Really, it's come to light over the last couple of years as more and more companies are trying to set their own net zero goals or carbon neutrality goals. And this is a concept that's in the Paris Agreement. We as an association support the Paris Agreement. We support firm caps on emissions that decline to zero, to net zero. So that's a rarity, I think, amongst the groups that work on this set of issues. And we focus a lot on Article 6 of the Paris Agreement that would provide sort of the accounting infrastructure for cooperation across borders to take place. In other words, sort of a trading infrastructure for it. And as we look at, so what does it take to get to net zero? One of the things that we've turned to is a set of economic models to help guide our thinking a bit. We've used the University of Maryland, the Pacific Northwest National Lab, to help us with this, to model what the potential is of cooperation under the Paris Agreement. Those 1.5 degree reports didn't really have much recent economic analysis to draw on. I think there was a lot done back in the Waxman-Markey era that was using a trading model. So we in the US do a lot of modeling, right? So, but for purposes of the 1.5 degree report, that was all stale. It wasn't really good references to use. So we've done some new work. And the top finding of it is that if you were to allow full-on international transfers to take place under the Paris Agreement, you could achieve the Paris, the NDC goals that are in these national contributions for 2030 at a savings of about 50% if you allowed that. Now that's a perfect world. Maybe that's a world we'll never get to, but it gives you a sense of the scale of the possible. If you added nature-based solutions to that, it could save about another 50%. If that was done in a way, Jason, as you talked about incentives, for enabling incentives so that countries use the savings to increase the targets they were able to take. You could also think about plowing those savings back into mitigation. And it showed that you could essentially, with those two things, sort of trading under the existing infrastructure, which is a lot of energy, you know, the clean energy revolution captured in there, plus nature-based, you could do roughly twice as much with the existing commitments at the same cost. Now, we weren't the only people that modeled this. Environmental Defense Fund runs its own models. Their findings were similar. The Electric Power Research Institute runs their own models. They found the same thing. So the point of it is, it's a prize worth fighting for. And if you're serious about getting to better than 2 degrees, you pretty much have to be serious about nature-based solutions and about cross-border cooperation. Otherwise, you can't really find a pathway, a cost-effective pathway to get there. So I think it underscores how important it is for this year to get the policy right. I guess we're going to Madrid instead of Santiago, but Madrid for the Article 6 negotiations. It's the only part of the Paris rulebook that was not completed last year in Katowice. And that was due to a number of issues, but part of it was Brazil's concern about, it has different views about accounting than many other countries do. So we really hope that we'll get past that. But it doesn't end there. And I think where I think the shining light of the future is for nature-based solutions, and something that we're determined to work on, is getting more compliant systems that accept nature-based units for compliance. That's something that you can really invest around. Martin could probably deploy a lot more capital around legal structures that allowed for that use than sort of a softer system. And my examples of that are, so the European emissions trading system is the largest in the world. It doesn't include any nature-based solutions in it. California, on the other hand, does. And California has a system that allows reductions from agriculture, not soils yet. I wish they did soils, but they don't do soils. But they do forestry, U.S. forestry improvements. And that has led to investment at scale just around that one state program. A province of Alberta in Canada also uses natural solutions. Australia has tried this. And more recently, I think one of the darlings in the developing world in the last 2 years has been Colombia, where they instituted a carbon tax, but they also allow forestry credits from Colombia to be quantified, verified, certified, and used for compliance instead of making a tax payment. It's those kind of innovations that I think enable companies to invest at scale and that would enable us to get on that pathway. So when you talk about incentives, that's immediately what goes to my head is underneath it all, good accounting under the Paris Agreement, under Article 6, and then credible systems built on top of that that take advantage of those flexibilities.
That's great, thank you. And a lot there that I want to come back to, including how to think about not just the theory of applying a carbon price to this space, but the administrability of it. How do you actually do it? And it raises different complexities, and the credibility, which you raised. And I think the academic research and other research that's been done about even the California program could charitably called mixed in terms of how much of the offsets are real reductions. And I want to come back and talk about that. So Ruth, let me turn to you next and just talk about how you view the role of natural climate solutions in achieving our climate goals. And maybe you can touch also on this question that Michelle put on the table about the trade-offs with other societal demands like food.
Yep, thank you, Jason. Thank you all for being here. I'm an ecologist, I'm a tree hugger. So if you tell me that nature can solve the climate problem, I will be thrilled. But I'm also a grandparent, and I have grandchildren who are breathing that awful air from the California fires, which are climate change induced. So I'm a realist like all of you are. I want to see the quickest, cheapest way to get the greenhouse gases out of the air. And with the nature-based solutions, there's still a lot of science to do. There have been some estimates which, in my opinion, have been inflated, and there have been some hyperbolic headlines, which does not at all take away from the potential of nature-based solutions as a part of the contribution to moving forward on our climate problem. But I think we have to be very realistic, and I think the science will play out and will settle, as Michelle said, as nature-based solutions being a part of a suite of approaches, and nature-based solutions cannot be used as a way to let up on the energy sector and the need to pursue reductions in that arena, because that, as we all know, is really the big elephant in the room. So with nature-based solutions, the way I see the way to move forward now is to keep the science going, to certainly learn from the well over a decade of project-based work and incentives and what has worked, but to keep attention on first-order issues. And I think those first-order issues are to eliminate as much as possible the large-scale deforestation, which is occurring in tropical forests, which is the major store of carbon. Unfortunately, we're going in the wrong direction. There was impressive gains in reducing deforestation in the past decade and a half, and now we're going backwards. So we need to change that around and go in the right direction again. And the other first-order focus that I see is on the vast areas of degraded, underutilized land that is out there, and it's degraded because it has been overused in the past. So to get those lands back into working condition, into improving the carbon content of the soil, and to making them both productive for people and productive for sequestering carbon is an important goal. And focusing on those degraded lands does not compete with the food trade-off, but in fact could benefit. But we need to be realistic in what these nature-based solutions can actually solve, and also to think of them in terms of what else nature-based solutions help us with. They help us with watershed protection. They help us with improving soil quality. And in so many ways, there are co-benefits of nature-based solutions, which I don't know from the policy and economic incentive side how that plays together, but is certainly a reason why we should focus on nature-based solutions, both for the climate problem and for many other reasons as well.
Thanks. Martin, Shell has been a leader in the industry in thinking about not just Scope 1 and 2 emissions, but Scope 3 emissions, and talking about the emissions from the use of the product, and obviously natural climate solutions has been an area of real focus. So tell us what Shell is doing and what you view as the role of this in the longer-term transition.
Yeah, thanks, Jason. Thanks for bringing us together here in New York today. It's great to be with such a sophisticated panel and audience to discuss nature-based solutions clearly in the context of climate change, which of course is urgent, but also complex. And the last thing we would want to project is that today we are discovering and discussing the one and only solution to it. In order to make progress on the agenda of climate change, clearly the hierarchy of avoiding emissions, reducing emissions, and compensating emissions needs to be understood and actioned. And this is in the compensation category. So if you don't act on avoiding and reducing, then you're going to get stuck. Maybe 1/3 along the way, if the potential that was mentioned is correct, and that it would still be significant, but clearly not enough. So if we look at the broader picture there, then clearly there's a need for a mosaic of different solutions need to be pushed. Power needs to be made totally zero carbon, and then electrification needs to be pushed to the limits of its potential, which we believe to be about 60% of the energy mix. So if we can achieve those two things through wind, solar, batteries, and better and more intelligent distribution and management systems, then that will have gone a long way. But then beyond that, it becomes a little bit harder to work. You get into the hard to decarbonize sectors that can't be electrified, that often need the power and energy density of a molecule. You get into the limits around biofuels production and the limits around second generation biofuels. You get into a part of the energy system that at the moment we don't know how to fully decarbonize. Yet, if we first get that 60% electrification in a clean way, that we'll have made a lot of progress. But the way we look at it at the moment is there will still be something around 20 to 30% of that energy system of the future that will still by itself produce CO2 emissions. And therefore you need negative emissions to compensate. This where, of course, carbon capture and sequestration will need to play a role, but it can't play a role everywhere. And there are certainly very many distributed ways of emitting CO2 that will be hard to address using CCS. And that, I think, is where in the long run, nature-based solutions will find their sweet spot. It is to compensate for the very, very difficult to avoid CO2 emissions. And then to know, and indeed there's a few studies around that say that actually they could cover about 1/3 of today's emissions if fully implemented. That gives you some comfort that along with that electrification journey and along with inventions in biofuels, that net zero system is actually possible and actually has a little bit of space to maneuver between CCS and MBS. But clearly the trajectory from today to that end system that is net zero or even net negative, as the IPCC would have us get to, is a very long and hard trajectory that requires progress to be made between energy producers, civil society, regulators, on a scale and a pace that we haven't achieved yet, and that we're not close to achieving, and that I think is the concern that everybody in this room will share. If you then specifically go to nature-based solutions, and we share the enthusiasm for the opportunity, and we freed up $300 million in the next 3 years to invest in equity money into projects that can generate nature-based carbon credits, and we hope to be so successful that we can then increase the pace of investment after that. Two of the critical issues with the industry at the moment is that it's really in its infancy. It is not actually easy to find ways to spend that much money in it, because the number of projects around it tend to be small. They tend to take a long time to come to fruition. And it's not yet, let's say, organized as a business that you can scale up to the extent that it needs to be scaled up. So this industry needs to get going and needs to find markets and needs to find ways to scale up its activity levels that it hasn't been at before. So that is one significant challenge. And parallel to that, the integrity and believability of this as a solution will need to be matured in the same place, because it's no good scaling up nature-based solutions, getting a lot of carbon credits into the system, if at the same time we don't build trust with public, general public and special publics, that actually these credits have integrity, that they are unique, that they actually are carbon sinks and they are lasting, that they're not kind of reversed 5 or 10 or 20 years into having been created. I think these parallel paths will require the full attention of everybody that is involved in this, and the full attention of regulators. I think Article 6 is a major contributor. I totally agree. I hope it will be solved in Madrid or otherwise in the UK next year. One of the things that give me a little bit of hope is that actually in absence of Article 6, we've seen a lot of voluntary procurement pop up over the last, even in the last 2 years when we have become more active in this domain. A lot of companies, a lot of individuals are now proving to be willing to voluntarily pay more for their electricity or for their fuel or for their energy usage if it can be carbon offset in this way. We've been experimenting with this with long-haul trucking, with LNG customers, with other customers. We're finding penetration rates that are higher than we expected in the absence of regulation. I think there is, in that sense, we're starting to see some fertile ground. I don't mean that to in any way other way than I mean it in, for carbon credits to become a more normal object to use. The final thing I would say, there is clearly in that end system, you want to reserve your nature-based carbon credits for the hard-to-abate sectors. I do think that in the intervening period, it's actually more important that we achieve scale and growth than that we are totally pure in in which energy or which CO2 source we are exactly compensating for. Because if we become too purist, we might slow down the growth of this industry. And we all know that what happens in the next 10 years in terms of getting our net carbon footprint down is much more important than what happens in the 2040s. So in that sense, scaling up this business in general and then becoming more mindful about the exact application to which part of the CO2 hierarchy we implement the credits to would be something I support. I do have one more final point before I hand over, which is the incredible opportunity there is here to also, for this development, if scaled up, to have a positive impact on the communities that are currently living and dealing with these forests and with particularly degraded land, where a lot of jobs and economic activities have left, where an aggressive nature-based solutions agenda can really bring back sustainable livelihoods and inject new life into communities in many different ways of meaning of that word. So this can be incredibly positive, but it will need orchestration beyond what has happened so far, and we're keen to play a role in that.
Let me just ask also a 30-second quick follow-up, which is, because I suspect it's something some people in the room may be thinking anyway, no disagreement at all that if we're serious about targets like 1.5 or 2 degrees or anything close to it, we need to be talking much more than we have about the difficulty of reducing emissions in hard-to-abate sectors. One of our research scholars, Julio Friedman, is in the back, who just put out a fantastic report, hopefully some of you saw, on the options to decarbonize in heavy industry like steel and cement. He, by the way, is leading by example. I can already see a question on Twitter that he has posed, so that will come to all of you in a minute. But your point, like, let's not think too much about where the nature natural climate solutions, or let's just scale it up. Talk about the role of an oil and gas major in this sector and in this industry, and how do we make sure, we've had two panelists already say we got to make sure that this is in addition to, not instead of, reducing emissions from our energy use, and that is still where most of the revenue for a company like Shell comes from. How do we build trust and confidence that we're all kind of thinking about this the same way, and why a company like Shell is spending as much time and effort on this as you are?
Yeah, I'd say the simple answer to this is that today we serve around 500 million customers every year, some of them every day, some of them once a year. If we think strategically about our future, in 30 years' time, 90% plus of these customers will only want to buy carbon and will be able to buy carbon-free energy, most of it electricity, but some other parts as well. So either we're going to be relevant to those customers in the next 30 years and in 30 years from now, or we're going to be increasingly irrelevant. And we believe that with the footprint, the scale, and the brand that we have, it would be a pity if we decided to be irrelevant in that journey. So strategically, it is clear that we need to get there. The real challenge is how do we go on the transition together with our customers? We need to invest in low carbon energy solutions for them, and then get them to buy it. And these two things need to happen in a kind of positive cycle. There are a number of examples around where we have pre-invested in low carbon solutions, but we have no customers then to buy them. And that's hard. And that's hard to scale it up. And there are other examples where we might have done more already and where we are lagging behind. I think when it comes to clean power, we could have been a larger provider of it than we are today. But when it comes to electrical vehicle charging or making hydrogen available, we're probably ahead of the curve. So we're needing to adjust as we go and invest increasing amounts of money in these low carbon solutions. So we're down to about $2 billion a year in let's say the avoid and reduce categories, and then about $100 million a year into nature-based solutions. So that's real money. That all adds up to significant investment. But at the same time, we don't think it's our role at the moment to tell a customer in a cold climate that we're not going to sell them natural gas to get through the winter, or to a customer that wants to bring their kids to school that we're not going to sell them gasoline because we believe they should be electrified. These kind of decisions eventually need to be taken by governments and regulators. What is allowed and what isn't. But within what governments and regulators allow and arrange for in terms of the regulations, we need to seduce our customers to increasingly go on that path of decarbonization, come with them, lead them to some extent, and then work for that to go fast enough to reach the Paris Agreement targets and more.
Thank you. Todd, you've been waiting patiently. There's a lot that's been said already for you to react or respond to, but talk a little bit about the work that you do and how you view the role of natural climate solutions in getting to where we need to go.
Sure. My name's Todd Stevens. I work for the, good idea. I work for the, I guess I could scream. I work for the Wildlife Conservation Society, headquartered at the Bronx Zoo, so your local conservation organization. You know, I think we come to this as a field-based conservation organization working in many of those tropical forests that I think Ruth and Michelle talked about. And I think that, you know, I don't want to read many of the messages, but I guess what I'll say is in my 10 years at WCS, I counted up last week, I think I've shelved 22 sort of natural climate solutions projects for a lack of demand. To be honest, like, we come to this as someone who have put forth a series of solutions, have gone out into the voluntary market, have sold credits, have tried. And in that sense, we're usually working for governments and local communities. You know, that's not WCS owning land. That's not our business. Our business is sort of empowering the people in the places that we work. And to be honest, we've been waiting for this price signal for a long time. And so let me just say sort of 4 quick things about natural climate solutions and why we think it's sort of an important solution. I think one is that we take quite seriously some of the science that Michelle talked about being 30% of the solution to 2030. We think that's real, we think it's actionable, and we think it's credible. And we can go through some of the problems, but the sort of overall sort of sense of getting going, we really share. And we think it's part of a journey of decarbonization that I'm really glad to hear sort of Martin articulate. I think the second thing is that when I say price signal, I think there are a lot of tropical countries who've been waiting for this, who really want to do this. And we see this both in local communities who have heard about a pay-for-performance scheme to help their forests, but haven't seen a lot of payment. And so for them, and us as an organization trying to sort of be a trusted partner, we really want the global community to step up and to sort of move those payments, because without that, I think we do lose trust eventually. And that trust actually is quite important between nations for any of the policy solutions we just talked about. And that is, in truth, what a lot of these tropical countries can deliver. I mean, absent a place like Brazil with a quite developed economy, many of these countries, that is what they're going to be able to give to the climate solution. And I think that enables us to have an equity conversation that comes out in a positive way. So I'll sort of say that. I think for us as a conservation organization, in these places that we're talking about, resides the world's biodiversity and resides the world's wildlife. Our mission is wildlife in wild places, and for us, this is a key way that I think we can meet both the climate commitments, but also our commitments to biodiversity in the world. So there are other conventions out there that maybe get a little less talk in the newspapers, but we'll talk about the biodiversity decline. This is a way for us to do both, and I think for us, that's really exciting. I want to say one thing that's going to be a little bit sort of off point, but I think is important that we as an organization really want to say is that there are a certain class of forests, we'll call them intact forests, and those forests are a sink. So when emissions go up into the earth, right, 25% go into the oceans, 25% go into the terrestrial sink, and the 50% into the atmosphere. If we were to lose that terrestrial sink, and we think that is really anchored in the intact forest, a lot of the curves that we all talked about wouldn't work. And so we really are trying to get a focus in the international community on these intact forests and the threat of degradation. That just means roads going through. That means the fragmentation of those forests, which stops them performing their historical function. So we are pushing pretty hard to get that as part of the climate debate. There is no financing right now for those forests, to be honest. Because really, to be honest, I think the community's been focused on the next tree that falls, not the degradation of these intact forests, and we're pushing pretty hard. As we think about reforestation in the new trees, to be honest, that kind of removal is going to take decades to come online, but the existing forests themselves, which perform this removal function, if we can protect them, it is possible for us to actually get that near-term action that we need. So, I really appreciate people coming out and taking interest in this topic, because I think it needs to become part of the political debate in the United States and beyond. So thank you.
Thank you. We have a lot of expertise here. I'm going to open it in a minute. Let me just ask one more question. I want to come back to the question I sort of teed up before. We're a policy center. I've spent most of my career as a policymaker, so that's kind of where my head goes. And I just want to ask people, and anyone can take this, or I'll call on people if no one jumps in, to get a little more granular about how we actually do this and pick up these opportunities. It's complicated, but I have a sense of how to apply a carbon price at the wellhead or the mine mouth. When we talk about natural climate solutions, and that's reforestation, afforestation, avoided deforestation, changed agricultural practices, maybe the Impossible Burger and Beyond Meat. I mean, there's a lot of things we're talking about. And if you want to create incentives for people to change their practices, have them be credible, you can monitor them, you can measure them, it's more complicated, I think. You can tell me if I'm wrong. To figure out how we do that. It's part of the reason I know many people who say, if we're going to pick up these opportunities, this just has to be an area where it is more about government spending than it is about incentives like a price signal. And maybe people agree or disagree. But talk to me about how we actually go about designing the instruments that are going to create the incentives to pick up these opportunities. And maybe a little bit about, for example, what Shell is doing. But others will have thoughts on that too. Who wants to speak to that?
I'll jump in.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, first of all, I don't think it has to be one or the other. I think there are places where government investment would be valuable, and there are places where the private entrepreneurial side of it, I think, has a lot to offer. And I guess, again, to get to the scale necessary, I think the private sector piece of it is going to be vitally important. The places that I've seen it work are where there is a pricing system that recognizes a unit that's produced from a nature-based solution. and that is quantified according to a standard, and there are standards out there. Maybe there's room for improvement of those standards, but we do have those standards. We use them in this country, in California, around how you quantify the benefit of the carbon stored in a forest. There's less done on the soils front, and I think that's an area that we really need a lot of work, and that's probably a good place for collaboration between government and business on measurement and verification techniques. But in Alberta, that is a place where we've seen units that are produced by farmers for improving tillage, going to no-tillage practices, where they can quantify what the improvement is, and those can be used in the compliance system, so they get paid. And when you have change in government, like they've recently had in Alberta, it's really interesting that that program seems to have a stability about it that maybe others don't, because it's not just energy companies that want that source of mitigation supply, but it's also farmers that are part of the solution there. And I think it's got a political resilience that's really valuable. But going forward, I think more systems, like I said, there are tax systems that accept these units, and there are also trading systems that accept them. And I think that's got the potential to unleash a private sector wave of investment that could be much larger than what governments are able to put in. I also think it helps with the stickiness of the policy, enabling it to stick, the good kind of stickiness, that it enables it to stick. And I'll use as an example, we've had this horrible situation in Brazil, right, with the fires. And you saw what happened with Norway and Germany pulling back their funding completely, right? Because there wasn't the kind of stickiness there. Maybe a private sector angle wouldn't have helped with that, I don't know. But I feel like it does make a difference when you've kind of got an army of locals that are bought into it and that are supporters of it.
Michelle, you wanted to come in?
Sure. Thanks. I'm going to give a few other insights and then turn it into a question for Martin. I mean, I think on the question of sort of public versus private, it's not either or, it's both and. I mean, certainly we need the policy signal from the governments, and certainly the revenues from programs that are cap and trade or taxes can then be redeployed into some of these solutions, and the governments really need to set the accounting rules for how we really credibly establish these things, and also set some of the safeguards on environmental and social outcomes. But there's a huge role for the private sector, too. And there's a company, I'm based in Boston, there's a startup there called Indigo Agriculture that's working on really the soil carbon piece and sort of taking their biotech, but then scaling it to, they're shooting for a teraton of soil carbon, but working on and soliciting ideas for how to actually measure and monitor that soil carbon, which is a really thorny problem technically. So they're putting a lot into that, and if it works, that would be a huge part of the solution set. I think the challenge in terms of these issues of the price signal and the lack thereof, and this is where the question for Martin is, if there are companies and others investing in these, put on my economist hat, generally investments only work when folks know what the rules of the road are and are convinced that those rules are going to stick around and you don't have moving goalposts. So to kind of get to the scale that we need and the level of investments, sort of in the billion rather than the hundreds of millions, I think we do need those rules, and we need to sort of make sure that people know, who's going to own these credits, how do they fit within the sort of overall, Kyoto crediting system. So my question to turn around for Martin is sort of the idea of like making the investments now and then figuring out later sort of who gets to put them on their balance sheet. Could you say a little bit more about why anybody would want to do that?
Yeah, no, thanks. It's clear the rule book will still shift in coming years, with Article 6 coming together and with verification systems being integrated and upgraded, and eventually hopefully settling in a place where everybody can play by the same rule book. We do believe that that the value of a carbon credit will go up over time, because they will become scarcer as the energy transition becomes a more pressing issue. And so from a business perspective, although at the moment I don't really know if I spend $100 million on this, whether every carbon credit will count in the same way and what exactly what it will be valued by, I guess it's just an entrepreneurial decision to say, I'll go, in trading speak, I'll go long carbon credits, I'll put them on my balance sheet, and I'll try to be part of the conversation as to how they can be applied and monetized over time. But it seems to me reasonable that unless we completely fail in triggering the energy transition, that these credits will be scarce elements over time. As an economist, I like owning scarce goods. And there is already quite a lot of guidance out there in terms of what are currently deemed to be highly credible projects. And so what we focus on, and we do some of it together, is to go to the projects that are currently deemed to be highly credible and that already travel relatively well. But most of them at the moment we sell into voluntary schemes around the world. And we find price points there that are sometimes interesting and sometimes less interesting. But to me, the fundamental insight is these things are going to be scarce. We might as well get going. Because in many cases it takes a bit of time also to generate these credits. You don't plant the forest and have the sink the next day. And so that all works together into a business case that I think is a responsible investment from an investor perspective, but also certainly from an energy transition perspective. Eventually, to get the price signal, clearly we need to open more and more of these schemes to the kind of solutions we're talking about. So the European the ETS system would today send a price signal of about $35 a ton, for which you can do lots of fantastic projects. The CORSIA system that the airline industry is maturing will no doubt send a price point, or can send a price point if well arranged, that triggers an enormous amount of opportunity in this space. So it is my sense, and it's our sense, that these things are potentially around the corner and worth an early presence and early investment into, because we need to deeply understand this sector. If it's going to be a larger part of our business, then we might as well get going early.
Thanks. Quick comment, and then we'll open it up.
Yeah, I can make a comment about the avoided deforestation piece. And we saw tremendous gains in Brazil in reducing their deforestation from the mid-2000s up until recently. And their deforestation rates plummeted, model to the world about reducing deforestation. And that there are many factors that went into that, but importantly, international reputation, the government at a national and state and municipality level putting in place credit policies and farmers, soy producers organizing themselves to self-impose a moratorium so that they would not have produced soy on deforested lands. A lot of that came from the European concerns that were made very publicly known, and that was very important. So that side of the international reputation and the governance at multiple levels is a big part of this. I think it's a little hard to see how that works in today's world, but perhaps things will change.
Yeah. The only certainty is we will not have stable, durable, predictable policy signals. There's a lot of questions. I'm going to take like 2 or 3 at a time and then give folks up here a chance to respond. The first question comes, so bring the microphone around. The first question from Twitter, actually, let me just tell you what it is, from Dr. Friedman, is what are degraded lands and how realistic is it that one can use them for nature-based CO2 removal at modest cost? So make a note of that. That's from Julio. And then there's one back here, and then we'll come up to the front.
Yes, I'd like
And if you
to...
could just briefly introduce yourself, and please keep the question brief.
Is this on? Okay. My name is David, and I'm from Sports Technology. 2 points that I'd like you to comment on. One is that the Watson Institute at Brown University has said that the U.S. Department of Defense has contributed about 720 metric tons of carbon in the last 10 years. So as Pogo said, maybe we've met the enemy and he is us. The other question is, in terms of bringing legal action against Nigeria, Congo, Brazil, and Indonesia for violations against human rights by destroying the carbon sinks of the world, let's go after them legally.
And then let's just go right, oh, did you have a question right there? And then the next round will come up to the front.
Hi, Justin Monshine with Mitigation Investment Holdings. We invest in nature-based solutions, so thanks for being here to further that end. We talked a little bit about the need for some regulation in order to create the space in which the market can scale, and we can get these nature-based solutions to scale. You know, I participate in a market today that I think is the largest environmental-based market. It's centered around 401, 404 regulations, Clean Water Act, that invests roughly $4 billion a year in nature-based solutions tied to water. My question relates to jump-starting the market and recognizing the extreme political difficulty of putting a price on carbon, recognizing it's been done in some places. At least as it relates to the United States, I'm wondering your thoughts on expanding jurisdiction, expanding programs around 404, 401 as sort of an intermediate step toward creating those carbon sinks, recognizing that there is a vibrant market in that space today, sort of on the road toward eventually getting that more global price on carbon.
Who wants to jump in on any or all of those?
Can I comment on the second one, which was around suing the non-OECD for taking its trees out? I think there is a whole debate and a debate that we need to have about what is a fair transition, what is a just transition, and that takes place in countries, about whether tax systems or government mandates are disproportionately affecting the poor versus the rich, and how to make sure that energy transition is something that an economy can withstand at all income sectors in a country. In the UK, for example, that's a very, and in Western Europe, that's a very strong debate at the moment. There's also an international variant of that fair transition debate around whether it is fair for people who live in the developing world to be constrained in the way that they grow their energy usage, while the developed world, who has gone through that stage and has had the unconstrained benefit of energy for 100 years, continues to emit. And I think that is actually a rich debate, which you can't totally settle, but I think it will be, in my view, fair for the rich world to disproportionately decarbonize ahead of the poor world, and therefore not to look too much to Congo, Nigeria, and Indonesia as the people to sue on day one. Particularly because I guess these people will turn around and say, Europe and the US used to be covered by forests as well. So if we're going to set legal precedent here, it depends a bit on how far you go back. But I guess we'll find that everybody is guilty here. And actually, the Brazilians and the Congolese and the Nigerians have done a better job of protecting their original forests than the Western world has. So I see that as a low priority action in the energy transition, if I can comment.
Any comment on the degraded lands or the incentive structures Justin asked about?
Okay.
The ecologist should handle the.
Okay, on the degraded lands, Julio, I'll give you my perception of degraded lands from where I work in a degraded landscape in India, which is lands that have been heavily overgrazed, heavily used, subject to fire, full of invasives, to the extent that people cannot really get anything productive out of them because they're so degraded and the soil has become of poor quality. So efforts to restore those lands, which would require some work with the soil and some planting of native trees perhaps, but to get those kinds of lands to the point where local communities can be using them. It's not to restore them so that they can be locked up and sold, but to the point that communities can get beneficial gain. They can get forest products. They can get fuel wood or graze their cattle or, for livelihoods. So right now those degraded lands are really not providing anything good for livelihoods, nor are they providing anything good for carbon storage. So to the extent that we can identify and have those lands be used, working lands, and also sequestering more carbon is a benefit all the way around.
And please, Todd.
So I wanted to say two things. The first part about it is how deforestation happens out there. I think we have an idea sometimes that it happens because, this very sort of macro sense about people needing to grow more food. When we deal with deforestation around the world, there's a whole lot of this concept called land grabbing that's actually happening, which is to say that, number one, people are actually after it for the timber, right? And so they form an agricultural concession, they take that over, they cut it all, and then they don't actually plant any food. And so I guess on the degraded land, it seems to me is a really great opportunity, as Ruth said, to invest in that, because it allows us actually to sort of stand up a little bit for our forests, which are not really being used for agricultural sort of products. It's sort of a Trojan horse. I guess I want to say the other thing, which is that when we talk about jurisdictional systems, which can get super duper nerdy very quickly, we're basically just talking about what the gentleman in the third question is talking about. He's talking about rules, and he's talking about trading, so that there's accounting. And I think even an organization like mine, which is, there's one person in this organization who got trained as an investment banker, we would support that because there's an overall accounting, which is to say that's what we really want. We just want some way to make sure that we don't have these sort of on one hand, we sort of say we're doing a nice thing, on the other hand, we're not doing such a nice thing. If there's an overall accounting in the system you're talking about, you get away from that. So I think while, certainly the problematic regimes in a lot of countries we work on aren't there, we would very much support that coming into being. And this price signal that we talked about is about a way to attract people to that, maybe versus suing them.
There were some questions up in the front. If we could bring the microphone up here. We'll start over here and then go over here.
Hi, Karen Feinberg, Feinberg Consulting, Harvard affiliated. This is a little bit of a question and an idea, if I may. So public-private partnerships important, startups important. Greentown Lab from Boston is a really cool place for people to get to know. Part of my background has been in media, and it seems to me media, do you agree that media needs to be a partner in this, in terms of if you're talking about selling it to the larger public? How do you get the larger public to actually buy in? And they're not necessarily going to buy into a nerdy storyline. And in fact, I was at a Columbia workshop at the architecture school around using storytelling and narratives for social good. And it seems that there would be a wonderful opportunity to partner with the media and communications groups at universities, for instance. So number one, you're going to help them, these storytellers, understand the issues. And number two, you create pilots that allow them to express in their own ways, PSAs, or in TV, radio, et cetera, podcasts. And it seems to me that that's an important opportunity to explore, to get the wider public, and in all kinds of ways to lobby government officials, funders, foundations, et cetera. So I would love for you to comment on those ideas, and I would love for you to do a pilot somewhere.
I'm going to try not to take offense at the suggestion that nerdy policy analysis is not how you effect change. Do you have a question in the? Oh, over here. Sorry. Yeah.
My name is Judith Weiss. I'm a marine biologist from Rutgers. And I study salt marshes. And there's been no discussion whatsoever about wetlands. As a lot of talk about forests and nothing about wetlands. I wanted to say that the wetlands, as far as I understand it, sequester carbon better than forests because of the peat that they're generating underneath. And the coastal wetlands are themselves in huge danger because of sea level rise. And unless there's space behind them to move inland, they're in danger of being drowned as the sea level rises. There is an invasive species of plants in our salt marshes that, many decades ago, the people got in the habit of removing it in the name of restoration. The species named Phragmites, and it enables a marsh to elevate faster. It sequesters carbon better than the native species in the wetlands. So here we have, what everybody views evil invader, but in terms of climate, it is doing better than the native species. And some of us think we need to do something about the perverse policies that surround this species, which is getting removed when it's doing, in this world, in the anthropogenic world that we're in now, it is doing much more good than harm.
Thank you. No, great point. And there's a question right next to you, Dr. Vijay Modi from Columbia.
Thank you. So I spent about a decade ago a lot of time trying to get carbon credits in the poorest part of the world, and I got gray hair doing it. And my question is twofold. One is whether at $35 a ton, so much of that fraction would go in measurement, building credibility, and it's actually smaller than putting a solar panel on a degraded land if you did not differentiate a ton of CO2 from solar or from sequestration. So that's one question. Should we have differentiation? Secondly, on scale. Okay, so even if we took 600 million hectares, which is 4 times the arable land of India, took the best way to sequester, and did it for 10 straight years, it would be about 1/10 of what Michelle mentioned, okay, the 200 gigatons of C. So there's a scale issue. So, and so the question there is, should we have differentiated something that helps the poor? And secondly, are there policies around livelihoods and jobs that would actually do more adaptable policies, scalable policies that would generate some sequestration anyway?
That's great. Okay, so, and kind of connected to the first a little bit. So questions about how we get the public to care about this, about coastal wetlands, and then Vijay's point about differentiation, livelihood, jobs, thinking about poorer countries around the world, and how you scale, how you think about scale in this space. I can call on people, but just jump in. Please, Michelle.
I'll try to address all those questions at once, because they're related, actually. I mean, the issue of communication, I mean, unfortunately, most of the media coverage has been focusing on offsets as a replacement for fossil fuel reductions and how it's not going to get us where we're going to go, and problems with the clean development mechanism and gaming and all that. So we have a lot of work to do to reestablish the integrity and the sort of legitimacy of nature-based solutions, even though it's critical to the whole ball of wax. So I do think telling stories and really engaging with folks on the ground. I mean, if we don't have the buy-in of local communities and local partners on this in each of these countries with the highest level of potential, we're not going to get anywhere. I mean, we've seen that happen in the U.S. With folks who are not bought in terms of federal land use decision making and what happens when that happens. So it kind of connects to this issue of how do we make this a sort of socially legitimate approach as well, and how do we make sure that people are getting jobs and those jobs are well paid. So we really kind of need to match the kind of top-down policy solutions that are coming out of the UN with what's happening on the ground at the country level and really the subnational level. Including huge potential for mangrove restoration, coastal wetlands. I mean, there's some challenges in terms of the science of the measurement there, but there's a lot of jurisdictions that are actively doing what's called blue carbon, and this is a huge potential for job creation too. In my home state of Massachusetts, we've got a whole division in ecological restoration group doing blue carbon in terms of the projects. Now we're trying to figure out how to actually measure that. So I think there's a combination of telling the story as a political strategy, really building on systems that have thus far kind of gotten some political durability, including the RGGI program, including the EU ETS program, including California, that have really brought the stakeholders to the table and tried to figure out it's not just about the carbon, it's got to be about the co-benefits. We've got to figure out how we can build, a socially and economically diverse constituency, which as policy wonks and economists, we have learned our lesson about not doing a good job on the cost-benefit analysis says this without looking at the impacts on people. People have to be at the heart of it. So if we can't figure out how to do that, marry the bottom up and the top down, figuring out the jobs and the local engagement, that's a major lesson learned from the political upheaval of the last 4 or 5 years from my vantage point.
Sure.
And I'll just pitch in if there's one political class that's worse at communicating than policy wonks, it's traders. So I think they're the bottom of the food chain because their attention spans are so short that it makes it difficult to get an entire thought across. But it is an area that I think they can tell you quickly whether it's a good trade or not, but whether it's like how you actually communicate and engage people, I think is an area that we all have a collective responsibility to work on. And I was just going to sort of endorse what Michelle said about the blue carbon, because I think that is an area that, in my mind, it was, even though we didn't say it like that, it's sort of encompassed in the nature-based thing, at least as we're thinking about it. And I think I've seen some really exciting opportunities come forward about possibilities for use. I think in the early days of discussions about blue carbon, it maybe got all tangled up in some of the other ocean acidification countering strategies and things like that maybe gave people the wrong idea. And now as you look at some of the strategies like you're describing, or I've heard about growing mussels as an amazing way to sequester carbon and provide food. And so I think there are some things there that we definitely need further exploration. I would love to see a system that accepted those kind of things for compliance. You would love it, Martin, because it also makes shells. So you would like that.
I enjoy my mussels, yeah. Maybe a couple of things indeed to also recognize a point on wetlands. We'd love to be able to invest there as well to create credits, and I think that moment will come. The communication point is actually quite a rich one, because when it comes to the communities where the credits are generated, there's all about the business case and in a way the case for what it can, the positive contribution it can make to their local economies and livelihoods. When it comes to, let's say, the consumers of carbon credits, it needs to be quite balanced. I sometimes worry that if we are too optimistic about the potential of nature, that it can lead to people relaxing, saying, well, if nature can solve a third of all the problem, let's get going with it and I'll change my behavior later. So linking that to there actually being a cost. One of the things, so we're selling voluntary carbon credits in Europe to companies that have long-haul freight and to consumers and to use of natural gas. And the interesting bit there is that so we're asking people to pay to net off their carbon footprint. And I think that's an important thing to put into people's minds, that this isn't something that will happen for free and therefore they can relax. This has a cost, and if they want to be part of the journey, they have to be willing to pay. What we find in this actually is that people are particularly willing to pay if they can see and touch the development. So a forest in the UK is a lot more popular with our UK customers than a forest in Indonesia. They find that very hard to, and so interestingly, that will in itself perhaps drive global development of this rather than only low-cost development, because you need to do something in the jurisdictions where you're actually getting people to, where you're actually charging the people for it. They want to see some result in their neighborhood rather than somewhere around the world that they find hard to verify. The last point that I found that I want to respond to is this thing. If we have this land, do we put solar panels on it, or do we use it for nature-based solutions? And of course, it's true that solar panels, in a way, are better at converting sunlight into energy than plants. They're more efficient, but they both solve different problems, because solar panels give you clean electricity, But in the final analysis of the energy system, we can only push electrification so far. And then you still need negative offsets for the hard-to-abate sectors, and they are no longer competing in that space. Then you actually need the nature-based solutions for the system to add up.
But if you give the same price and don't differentiate it, which one will happen?
I guess the solar panels will happen until the electricity market is saturated.
Right.
But by the time it's saturated, then you will make the you will get into nature-based solutions in your example.
So one of the positive things of the sort of what I would call the drought of the last 10 years in terms of nature-based solutions is that it forced us, I think, to go back to the drawing board and figure out maybe how we were doing these things. So mangroves, for us, have been successful in places where they increase fish populations. That's really the selling point of those. So their job's about putting them in. They're increased fish populations, which gets local communities buy-in. We're measuring the carbon, we weren't selling it, right? Because there was no market for it. But the point about that is that created a sort of a bottoms-up communication, because those are all voters, right? And so for us, one of the things we've been thinking about is, also because we're not that great at it, is to try and have communication efforts that happen in those countries in the ways that those happen, which are not here. And so we have spent some time trying to invest in local communication organizations to try and put that forward in the local elections that it's happening, not even getting to national elections, because that's a difficult place for us, but trying to build that kind of local community support through projects that are really livelihoods projects underneath. You have wildlife biologists running around making sure that things are working, but that's really been a strategy that has been working. If we could add a carbon part to that, it'd be much easier for us to expand those at a much greater rate. Not because the carbon is a tipping point. The carbon's not all about it. The carbon is an added bonus that makes something able to scale. That's really sort of how I think the economics have worked when we looked at it.
I'll just say, I think the part of the way you get the public to care about this is, I think, helping people understand the response Martin gave to Vijay's question, that when we have must have and do have a growing concern about climate and marches and rallies and the Green New Deal, and we are talking largely about growing renewable energy, and then people understand electricity is 25% of global emissions, or when we talk about electric cars, and cars are 25% of global oil use, what it means to take these targets of 1.5 or 2 degrees seriously and the scale of that challenge. In my view, I just think that needs to be better communicated, and then we start to have conversations about things like natural climate solutions, or some of the other work we're doing at the Energy Center on carbon capture, direct air capture, decarbonizing heavy industry, hydrogen, nuclear, whatever. We're not advocating, but we need to be looking at all of these things if you're having a serious conversation, in our view. Let's take another set of questions. I don't know where the microphone is. Is it back there? Okay.
Good morning. Michael Scanlon with Civil Leaf Partners. Thank you for your very upfront, open thoughtfulness. Except for you, Martin, but I think a lot of your business is in California. If you were living in California, all 5, 6 of you there, how would you address this concern in your family with your children, and how we can make that maybe a part of the discussion that we don't want to ever forget, is we're leaving this legacy for our children.
Great, thank you. There was 2 questions up here. Sorry, we'll go back there next. It was right there.
We're talking about...
Can you just introduce yourself very briefly?
My name is Olive Freud. I'm not connected with the university, but I am an active environmentalist. I'm the president of the Committee for Environmentally Sound Development. We're talking about climate solutions and nature-based solutions. The first speaker did talk about population increases, but I wonder if part of the solution isn't some kind of control on population. And what it is we can do about that.
And there was a question right over here.
Hi there, Zach Byram, MPA candidate at Columbia for the Environmental Science and Policy Program. So we're talking about a suite of natural climate solution tools here. And one thing that I haven't heard mentioned, similar to coastal wetlands, are kelp farms. Now it's a bit more of a nascent area, kelp farms. Yeah, a bit more of a nascent area and not as low-hanging fruit, no pun intended, as trees are. But there's some evidence that they are more effective as carbon sinks if you took all the opportune locations for kelp farming. So I was curious, just in your opinions, where kelp farming could play in this suite of policy tools.
There was a question on Twitter as well about the potential for ocean-based solutions like seaweed. So maybe people want to comment on that. First question was about California. You brought that up, Ruth. Do you want to comment on that, or any of the others?
I did bring that up because I said my grandchildren are breathing that air, and I think, Winston Churchill said every crisis is an opportunity, or I'm sure I just mangled Winston Churchill, but something to the effect of using crises as opportunities. So it is a real opportunity, as awful as it is what's going on in California and other places around the world that are suffering from poor air quality, to use it as a communications possibility about how climate change is here and affecting us right now.
Anything on the oceans piece you want to comment?
Oceans, I will say I don't know the details about the kelp, but I would, what Michelle said is about a very active area of research on blue carbon, and we need to be doing all of this, looking into all of this. Now, the science and the policy are moving together, so we have to figure out how to make that work so that the policy doesn't get out in front of good science. But we can't just wait until science is done and then think about the policy.
Anyone else on California, population, oceans, kelp, seaweed?
Just a thought on the California piece. I mean, one of the issues for these enormous western wildfires and both the loss of carbon, but the impact on air quality. The Forest Service for years has been trying to do removal of low-grade biomass, and it's one of these issues where it's not economic for them to do this, basically to sort of sell that low-grade biomass. Usually the contractors want to go in and take out and high-grade some of the better timber. So it's this sort of, cycle that goes back to the early 1900s when the Forest Service just started suppressing fire in the West, when, that was not really ecologically the most sound approach, given these forests are designed to burn. But here we are. So we've got, homes built very close to these forests. So this is something we've got to tackle, not just in California, but throughout the West, and in other places too. And just related to the communications piece, it's really, I think we do ourselves a disservice and our inability to really talk about the things that people care about. And we lead with climate, we should be leading with air quality, we should be leading with water, we should be leading with economic development and sort of carbon being the co-benefit instead of all these other things, especially when we've got, degraded air quality that is responsible for more deaths than HIV, malaria, and a few other infectious diseases combined, which are often the focal point for the international health community, but air quality kills more than all of that. So huge opportunity, anybody who's following what's going on in Delhi right now can see that. And what was kelp. I have colleagues that are coming out with a sustainable ocean economy report, I think for release at COP, that should address some of these kinds of opportunities. But we do need to be thinking more holistically about the connections between the land and the ocean when it comes to carbon and these opportunities.
Todd, you?
I just want to say a quick thing. If you think about your kids and your grandkids, I think climate adaptation has to come into this. So we really have been talking about climate mitigation, but I think we have to all admit that there's going to be a whole lot of adaptation that's going to take place over the next 100 years. And I think that there's a lot of things to say. I think within our sort of scope, one of the reasons I think we're so committed to some of this forest conservation is that you can pretty well track where wildlife have been able to persist during sort of climatic events in the past. Those happen to be actually some of these carbon-rich forests. We're going to go through a pretty terrible bottleneck for biodiversity. So protecting these forests is not only a climate solution, but it's also sort of our natural heritage that we want to get through what is going to be a very difficult period, even if we do all the right things. And so I think for us and for me, I think Nature Climate Solutions, again, as I tried to say before, is able to do both a mitigation and adaptation part. What was also said about the coastal wetlands is it's going to deal with storm surges much better than a lot of built environment. Not every time, it's not always economically the best, but there are places where it's going to prove to be quite a useful and I would say resilient sort of adaptation strategy.
Just perhaps one thing which it is a slightly bizarre effect, but I do think that clearly climate change is causing extreme weather events. Now, the California fire is an extreme event. Whether it's a weather event is, I'll leave in the middle. But at the same time, extreme weather events can increase public acceptance of measures. And I think one of the key challenges for policymakers and for companies in this space has been the lagging public acceptance to actually want to make trade-offs in order to address climate change. People are very happy for their lives to be carbon lighter if it doesn't cost them anything, but more reluctant to reach for their wallet or adapt their lifestyle if that is the thing that's required. And changes to general public acceptance are often caused by trigger events, not by better communication strategies or etc., but simply something happens that causes a shift in mindset. We've seen in the UK went to net zero by 2050 under a conservative government, and it was very much related to a shift in mindset that took place after Extinction Rebellion took the headlines and after people started to really consider this became more front of mind. And I think regulators and companies and policymakers need to, in a way, use the increased confluence of these weather events to almost, in a way, tactically take advantage of it to push regulation and to push change harder at the moments that the public acceptance for it is increased. And so it's a slightly tactical game, but I do absolutely think that is a way to make more progress faster. And in that way, hopefully, you can find a tipping point where the extreme weather events go the other way again.
Right. I'll note for the record, there didn't seem to be support for revisiting Paul Ehrlich's population bomb 50 years later. I wanted to close, unless, because we have 2 minutes left, and what I wanted to do is just ask each of you, so we're going to end on time, just one bullet, if you were to add to, say, the climate plans of any of the Democratic candidates, or, Martin, in your case, you can pick the European Union in Brussels, the Commission, what would you prioritize, what you would want to see in prioritized in an agenda for a more robust climate policy that people would act on from day one to move the ball forward on natural climate solutions? Todd, let's go in the other order. That's unfair, Todd, because you're just getting this question, but I'll start with you.
I think I'm going to kind of push to some of the one of the questions that I had on sort of mitigation, which is compliant markets, move people, and I think trying both in the United States and then around the world to try and foster that will move private investment. So for me, it's about rules and regulations. It's actually very political in that way that would change. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'd just say as broad-based as possible a carbon price or carbon tax. As an economist, I prefer a carbon price, but by now we'll take whatever mechanism to just put a broad-based price on carbon for your election here in the US, for the European Union to broaden its ETS approach, and eventually I'd say for the two to connect these markets, because that to me is the single thing that's going to make a big change. Ruth?
Yeah, I had the same thought. Carbon tax, carbon price, whatever the incentive is that incentivizes across the board ways to get at climate solutions.
I know what Dirk's going to say. Go ahead.
No, I might surprise you. I would tell them to focus on the net zero goal, and that because I think net encompasses the need for limits, absolute limits, and on having natural solutions and technological solutions. But I think that's what I would focus on. In other words, I'm sort of saying focus on the cap. Mm-hmm.
And I would say forests and farms, not just for the carbon, but for the air quality, for the water quality, for the biodiversity, and for sustainable economic development.
Great. Okay, thank you. Well, we have one of our largest research programs is on how you design and implement a carbon price, so that's good to know we're headed in the right direction and spending time hopefully on something useful. This has been a really useful hour and a half, in my view. Hopefully you all agree, talking about this topic, which in my view doesn't get talked about enough, and how we think about our long-term deep decarbonization goals. So thank you all for joining us. And thank our panelists, obviously. As I mentioned, the full video recording will be available on our website in a few days. This is one of a number of great events we have going on at the Center on Global Energy Policy. Our next will be held Friday, live streamed for those who may not be able to join in person, in the faculty room of Low Library on campus, where we'll be hearing from the chief economist of Equinor about their Energy Perspectives 2019, moderated by Dr. Melissa Lott, a new research scholar at the center on where they see the energy sector headed. Thanks again to all of you for being here, and please join me final time in thanking our panelists for spending time with us.